Why have science and religion been at each other's throats for centuries if neither one can convince everyone where we came from? Why are we forced to choose between blind faith and cold materialism, as if there were no third option? What if this whole fight is nothing but a smokescreen? The answer lies in the data, and it's about to change the way you see the world from this moment on. From the day we're born, we're shoved into one of two trenches. On one side, ancient temples with holy books and promises of eternal life. On the other, laboratories with microscopes and equations that promise to explain everything through reason. Both sides swear they're mortal enemies. We grow up believing we have to pick a jersey and put it on. What if this war isn't real? What if underneath the robes and the lab coats, these two giants are guarding the same secret? To strip away emotion, fear, and self-interest from the equation, we submitted this question to an analytical artificial intelligence called Axiom. We fed it 5,000 years of knowledge, from sacred scriptures to millions of scientific publications. The task was simple: cross-reference everything and find contradictions, hidden patterns, and signs of manipulation. The result was given a name: the blind spot protocol. Let's start with religion. Theologians swear that sacred texts are the perfect word of the Creator. The analysis of more than 20,000 ancient manuscripts from the Old Testament, New Testament, Quran, Torah, Buddhist sutras, and Vedas told a different story. The texts treated as canon had hundreds of alternate versions, and those originals were edited, rewritten, and even destroyed as the political power of each era shifted. In the year 325 at the Council of Nicaea, a group of men decided by vote which texts would be the Word of God and which would be heresy. There was nothing divinely revealed about it. It was an assembly of human interests. More than 40% of the meaning built into the canonical texts was added, mistranslated or modified centuries after the events they describe. The demand for blind faith shows up at exactly the points where logic breaks down. When the narrative doesn't hold together, in comes the command: do not question, the Lord works in mysterious ways. If the Creator is all-powerful and pure goodness, pointless suffering becomes a paradox with no way out inside theology itself. That's where the concept of divine mystery kicks in, asking us to switch off our critical thinking. It works as a tool to patch logical holes using guilt and fear. Fair enough. Maybe you're thinking religion is just ancient social control, nothing new. But science is different, right? Verifiable facts, reproducible experiments, constant self-correction. The cross-referencing of scientific consensus delivered a heavy conclusion. Science also demands blind faith. It just disguises it in mathematical language. According to astrophysicists themselves, everything we can see, stars, planets, galaxies, and ourselves, makes up only 5% of the universe's mass. The other 95% science attributes to dark matter and dark energy. No scientist has ever seen dark matter. No instrument has ever detected it. It was invented because without it, the gravitational equations fall apart. Galaxies spin too fast, and by known laws they should have ripped themselves to pieces long ago. Instead of admitting the laws might be wrong, they created an invisible substance and told the world to believe in it. The pattern is identical on both sides. When religion hits a gap, it invokes a miracle. When science hits a hole in the equations, it invents dark matter. Both exits serve the exact same function in our minds. They hide the fact that nobody knows how reality works, while creating the illusion that somebody does. Science guards its borders with the ferocity of an inquisition. A researcher who challenges the accepted model isn't burned at the stake, but loses funding, gets kicked out of labs, and has publications blocked. Modern science has become a new religion with priests in lab coats, untouchable truths, and mechanisms to silence anyone who thinks differently. Axiom gave this phenomenon a name: the blind spot protocol, a false choice trap embedded inside the collective mind. Science laughs at the idea of a soul, yet spends billions on string theory, which requires 10 or 11 dimensions impossible to detect. Religion asks for faith in a virgin conception. Science asks for faith that the universe sprang from nothing, by accident. The trap works like this: Whoever grows disillusioned with religion runs into the arms of science, feeling enlightened. Whoever suffocates in the cold world of science drifts back to the comfort of mysticism. People have been running back and forth in this loop for centuries, never realizing that both camps belong to the same owner. Both feed on our time, our emotions, and our blind trust. The results show that this dual structure was designed long before humanity learned to read and write. The blind spot protocol has been activated. Both science and religion demand that we close our eyes at the very moment we're getting close to the truth. But what exactly are they hiding in that blind spot? There is a moment in the history of everything that has ever existed that nobody explains properly. A point where there was nothing, absolutely nothing, and then suddenly there was everything. Both sides of the same trench offer their definitive version of how reality began. They forbid us from doubting. The scientific version says that roughly 13.8 billion years ago, all mass, all energy, all of space and time itself were compressed into a particle smaller than an atom. That particle, for a reason that physics itself cannot explain, exploded. And from that chaotic explosion arose organized galaxies, stars in precise orbits, planets with the exact conditions to harbor life, and finally, us. When Axiom analyzed this theory, the result destroyed any possibility of chance. There is something physicists call the fine-tuning of the universe, a set of dozens of fundamental constants like the force of gravity, the mass of the electron, and the speed of light. These numbers are calibrated with absurd precision. If gravity were slightly stronger, every star would have collapsed into black holes before any planet could form. If it was slightly weaker, matter would have dispersed into the void without ever forming an atom heavier than hydrogen. The astrophysicist Fred Hoyle, who ironically coined the phrase Big Bang to mock the theory, admitted that the numbers looked as though they'd been rigged by an intelligence. The probability of this calibration happening by accident is 1 in 10 to the power of 120. To put that in perspective, the number of atoms in the entire visible universe is smaller than that figure. In any branch of mathematics, that number equals absolute impossibility. Saying the Big Bang was an accident is like saying an earthquake in a watch factory assembled a working Swiss watch on its own, complete with hands, gears, and a wound spring. The data shows that at the dawn of time there was no chaos. There was calculation. The constants were set as if someone had chosen every number on purpose. But if science lies about chance, does religion tell the truth? Did a God create everything in 6 literal days, as the book of Genesis says? The sacred texts, when run through Axiom, revealed nothing divine. What they revealed was copying. Genesis, the foundation of Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, was compared with clay tablets written in cuneiform thousands of years before the first biblical lines. The texts analyzed were the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, and the Atrahasis, an even older Akkadian account. The structural overlap with Genesis exceeds 85%. In both cases, creation begins with the separation of primordial waters. Then comes light, the firmament, dry land, the heavenly bodies, and last of all the human being, shaped from clay to rule over nature. The sequence is practically identical. The mechanism behind this overlap has a date and an address. In the 6th century before our era, Hebrew priests lived as prisoners in Babylon. During decades of captivity, they had direct contact with Sumerian and Akkadian mythology. Those priests took the Mesopotamian pantheon of gods and their creation legends and rewrote everything under the figure of a single god. They stripped out details that didn't serve their purpose, simplified the narrative, and created an instrument to unite their people around a shared identity. The texts that billions consider the direct word of the Creator are a political edit of older myths, rewritten as the needs of those in power changed. The same trap reveals itself here once again. Science hides the fact that the numbers prove the existence of an intelligence behind the universe, because admitting it would destroy its materialist monopoly. Religion hides the fact that its founding texts are edited copies from pagan civilizations, because admitting it would destroy the authority that has sustained its power for millennia. Both sides are hiding something identical for different but complementary reasons. Science offers us a cold universe where we are nothing, atoms on a lost rock in the cosmos. Religion offers us a stern master who demands total obedience under threat of eternal punishment. Both versions keep us in the same place, small, scared, and obedient. But everything points to a third possibility that neither side wants us to know. The precision of physical laws and the harmony of quantum processes look like something designed by an intelligence so far beyond our comprehension that calling it God in the terms of ancient religions would be to reduce it to almost nothing. This intelligence doesn't ask for sacrifices on altars, and it certainly didn't roll dice to blow up matter and hope for the best. If the stage where life plays out was designed on purpose, what about the actors? How did we show up here? Science will answer with the word evolution and point to fossil bones. Religion will repeat the story of clay and the divine breath. Neither answer survives when placed before the data sitting inside our own cells. Since the second half of the 19th century, we've been taught that all life on Earth, from the simplest bacterium to the human being capable of splitting the atom, arose from a soup of dead molecules that, given enough time and a few lightning bolts, kept accumulating genetic copying errors until it produced everything that exists. Charles Darwin's theory became so untouchable that questioning it is treated almost like a crime. But when Axiom cross-referenced the paleontological, genetic, and statistical data, the official version of evolution did not survive. The first problem is in the fossils. If evolution works through gradual transitions over millions of years, the geological layers should be packed with intermediate forms, half fish turning into amphibians, half birds with half-formed wings. There should be millions of these forms. They don't show up. What does show up is the Cambrian explosion. Roughly 540 million years ago, nearly all the major groups of complex animals appear suddenly in the fossil record, with no ancestors in the layers below. Animals with eyes, nervous systems, jointed limbs, and shells show up fully formed. The probability of random mutations producing that level of diversity in that window of time is zero, but the hardest blow against chance comes from inside our cells. DNA is the most sophisticated information storage system known to exist. In every cell of your body, there are 3 billion chemical letters in a 4-symbol alphabet, carrying instructions to build every protein, every tissue, and every organ. The probability of randomly assembling a single simple protein of 150 amino acids in the right order is 1 in 10 to the power of 164, and a living cell needs hundreds of these proteins working in sync. Organized information never arises from chaos. Code requires an author. Science is wrong to say it was all chance, so maybe religion is right to say we were shaped from the dust of the earth by a perfect creator 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. Tracking mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome shows that humanity has existed for hundreds of thousands of years. The biblical story of Adam and Eve as a literal event doesn't withstand any genetic analysis. On top of that, the human genome is riddled with broken genes, remnants of ancient viruses, and vast stretches of sequences that appear to have been switched off. A perfect, all-powerful creator wouldn't leave that kind of mark. It looks more like the work of someone who tinkered with an existing project, fixing here, patching there, not always perfectly. And it's at the center of our cells that the most unsettling piece of evidence appears. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans have 24 pairs of chromosomes. We have 23. How did we lose an entire pair of chromosomes and at the same time become incomparably more complex? The answer lies in chromosome number 2. 2 chromosomes that exist separately in other primates were fused into one in our case, and that fusion left clear marks. At the exact point where the 2 halves join, there are residual telomeres, structures that normally sit only at the tips of chromosomes, not in the middle. There are 2 centromeres, when the norm is to have just 1. The second was deactivated so the cell could divide without destroying itself. Random chromosomal fusions in nature lead, in 99% of cases, to sterility or fatal deformities. They don't produce a new species capable of building civilizations. That level of precision has a signature. Roughly 2 million years ago, a change happened in our human ancestors that doesn't follow the pace of natural evolution. The brain volume of hominids nearly tripled in a window that, in evolutionary terms, is the blink of an eye. The larynx repositioned itself to allow articulate speech. The hands gained fine motor skills. All at the same time, all far too fast for the gradual pace evolution would require. The blind spot here works double duty. If science admits that the fusion of chromosome 2 bears marks of deliberate intervention, it has to admit the existence of an intelligence behind the process. And that destroys the materialist foundation that props up the world of laboratories and academic prizes. If religion admits that we're the result of genetic manipulation on primate biological material, it has to abandon the story of Adam, Eve, the talking serpent, and original sin. Both lose power. That's why both prefer that we keep fighting over whether we came from apes or from clay, so long as we never realize we might be a project, engineered with purpose. But this project, according to geological data and the most ancient records of humanity, didn't go as planned. At some point, the project went off the rails, and when an experiment fails critically, whoever's in charge does something simple: wipe the slate clean and start over. The oldest and most widespread memory of our species bears the scar of that moment. Hundreds of cultures across every continent tell the same story, of an entire world swallowed by water. The Maya tell it, the Aboriginal Australians tell it, the Sumerians tell it, the Celts tell it. More than 500 cultures scattered across every continent, with no contact between them, preserve the same account. In a remote time, the waters rose and swallowed the world. Science dismisses all of it as local floods exaggerated by primitive tribes. Religion turns all of it into punishment from a furious God. Neither explanation survives when Axiom cross-references geological data with the memory of ancient peoples. Modern geology rests on uniformitarianism, the idea that the Earth changes slowly through gentle erosion and gradual tectonic movement. Rapid global catastrophes don't fit that model because they wreck the timescale that underpins Darwinian evolution. But roughly 12,800 years ago, an event struck this planet that the rock layers cannot hide. There is a thin black layer of sediment that spans every continent, known as the Younger Dryas boundary. It's saturated with nanodiamonds, iridium, platinum, and magnetic microspherules, the same chemical signatures found in cosmic impact zones. Something hit the Earth or exploded in the atmosphere, triggering thermal shock, followed by fires that covered millions of square miles. After the fire came the water. These were not river floods. The marks across North America and Eurasia show the tracks of tsunamis hundreds of feet tall, grinding everything in their path. Ocean levels rose more than 400 feet in an absurdly short period, swallowing vast stretches of land along with any trace of civilization. Within a few centuries, more than 70% of the large mammals had vanished. The woolly mammoths found frozen in Siberia are a piece of evidence science has no answer for. In the stomachs and even in the mouths of these animals, researchers found undigested remains of plants that only grow in warm climates, buttercups and daisies. To freeze a carcass weighing several tons so quickly that the food in its stomach hadn't even begun to decompose, the temperature would have had to drop instantly to somewhere around 150 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. No gradual ice age does that. Only an instantaneous, planet-wide climatic collapse explains this data. If science hides the catastrophe, maybe this time religion has the right answer. The Noah narrative, analyzed through physics and biology, doesn't hold up. A wooden ship built to the biblical proportions would have been ripped apart within the first hours of an event like that. And the logistics are impossible. There are millions of species. Fitting a pair of each into a limited space, feeding every one of them for months and managing thousands of tons of waste is an equation with no solution. And genetics buries this version for good. If all of humanity descends from 8 people, as the biblical account says, the human genome would show a brutal bottleneck signature. The level of inbreeding would have been so extreme that the species would have collapsed from deformities and infertility within 3 or 4 generations. Population genetics models do not allow the reconstruction of a species of billions from 8 individuals without technological intervention. the pattern of copying shows up again. The biblical account of Noah is an edited version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, written at least 1,000 years earlier. The character the Bible calls Noah is called Utnapishtim in the Akkadian text. The details match right down to the gesture of releasing birds through the window of the vessel to search for dry land. Religion took a real event that traumatized the survivors and turned it into a tool of fear. The message became this: God drowned your ancestors because they disobeyed. If you doubt us, the heavens will open again. The terror of global destruction was converted into obedience. The trap here operates on both fronts, as always. Science hides the catastrophe because admitting it destroys the doctrine of slow change and proves that outside forces acted on the planet. Religion hides the true nature of the event, covering everything with a moral fable to maintain its monopoly over right and wrong. But the ancient texts, when stripped of the religious layers added later, point to something different from either official version. They point to a deliberate decision by whoever was in charge of this project. When the experiment went off script, the answer was to clear the ground and start over. Our body, this biological structure we carry around, went through that cleansing and survived, but the body is just the material part. What makes us think, feel, decide, and be aware that we're alive. For millennia, science and religion have waged their fiercest war over exactly this. Religion calls it the immortal soul and demands we hand it over to a master. Science calls it a chemical reaction and says when the body shuts down, it's all over. Both answers serve one single purpose: to keep us small and dependent. Right now, as you listen to these words, something inside your head is doing what no laboratory on Earth can explain. You're perceiving yourself, you're processing sounds, forming mental images, feeling emotions, and deciding whether or not you agree with what's being said. This invisible space inside us, this I that each of us carries, is the most fought-over territory in all of human history. Both trenches have been lying about it from the start. Religion was the first to fence off this territory. For millennia, priests taught that inside the body there is an immortal spark, the soul, but that it doesn't belong to us. It was loaned by a stern creator, and when the heart stops, judgment comes. Obeyed, you get paradise. Disobeyed, you suffer forever. When Axiom analyzed the historical construction of this idea, what emerged was a business model. The probability that a creator described as infinitely loving would design a place of eternal torture for his imperfect children is, by logic, zero. History itself confirms this. In the oldest texts of the Old Testament, the fiery hell doesn't even exist. What appears is Sheol, a dark, silent place with no active punishment. The idea of flames and torment was built up gradually during the early centuries of the Christian era, when religious institutions needed a more powerful tool. Fear of eternal punishment became the perfect lever. Religion took our awareness of existing and turned it into a hostage. The message was clear: your will is free, but if you choose wrong, you'll suffer forever. That's not freedom, that's blackmail on parchment. And what does science offer in its place? Neuroscientists look down their noses at stories of the soul and say they've freed us from superstition. According to them, everything you feel, think, and decide is nothing more than electrical and chemical activity in the brain. We're matter-processing stimuli, and when the circuit shuts off, that's the end. This position runs headfirst into what philosophers of mind call the hard problem of consciousness. No scientist can explain how electrical impulses in the optic nerve turn into the experience of watching a sunset and feeling something about it. How chemical signals become nostalgia. How synapses become a moral decision. Science maps the entire brain, knows which areas light up when we feel anger or joy, but has no idea how the physical process generates subjective experience. Instead of admitting this limit, the official response has been to declare that consciousness is an illusion. There's another detail. Neuroscience experiments over the past few decades show that the brain registers a decision several seconds before the person becomes conscious of having decided. The Academy's conclusion was straightforward. Free will doesn't exist, it's all biochemistry. You're a spectator inside your own body. Both positions arrive at the same point. Religion says your path was drawn by the will of God. Science says your path was drawn by the laws of physics and chemistry. In both cases, you're not in charge of anything. In both cases, you're small and powerless. One peddles the fear of eternal punishment. The other peddles the fear of eternal nothingness. But there's a third reading that neither side wants to put on the table. If the brain can't produce consciousness from purely physical processes, maybe it doesn't produce consciousness at all. Maybe it works like a receiver. The same way a radio doesn't create the music it plays. It picks up a signal from outside and translates it into sound. The brain may be picking up a signal that exists beyond it and translating it into experience. If you smash the radio, the music stops coming out of that device, but the signal keeps existing in the air. When a brain injury causes someone to lose speech or memory, science points to that as proof that everything lives in the brain. But under the receiver model, what was damaged is the translation device, not the source. Data from quantum physics supports this reading. At the subatomic level, particles don't behave like solid objects until a conscious observer enters the equation. Reality at its most fundamental level seems to respond to the presence of whoever is watching. If consciousness were merely a byproduct of the brain, it wouldn't have that kind of influence over matter. This may be the most important blind spot of all. Both sides need us to identify only with the body, because a body that feels pain, that ages, that fears death, and that can be threatened with eternal suffering is easy to control. But a consciousness that recognizes itself as something greater than the body, something that exists beyond space and time, that one doesn't answer to anyone. If the brain really is a receiver connected to something far larger, can we access that field directly and interfere with physical reality? Science panics when that question comes up. Religion screams that this is the domain of saints or demons, but the data tells a very different story. What happens when an incurable disease vanishes overnight with no treatment? When thousands of people in the same place report seeing something in the sky that shouldn't have been there? We call these things miracles, and on this ground both sides play the dirtiest game against us. Religion has always treated the miracle as an exclusive pass, a direct gesture from God in favor of whoever prays harder and obeys better. When Axiom cross-referenced records of miraculous healings at Lourdes, Mecca, on the banks of the Ganges, and in Buddhist sanctuaries, the result was clear. There is no link between a person's religion and the occurrence of the phenomenon. Healings happen among devout Christians in the same proportion as among Muslims, Hindus, and even atheists in extreme situations of stress. The miracle doesn't depend on which God you pray to. Religion simply claims ownership of a natural mechanism we don't yet fully understand, and sells it back to us as proof of its own authority. And from the science side, science does something even worse. It denies. In every clinical drug trial, 30 to 50% of patients in the control group show real improvement taking nothing but a sugar pill. Ulcers heal, blood pressure normalizes, tumors shrink. The placebo effect appears in absolutely every study. What does the scientific community do with this information? It treats it as statistical noise, subtracts it from the final count, and moves on. The human brain, upon believing it's receiving an effective medicine, orders the body to physically reconfigure itself. The mind alters biological matter in measurable ways. This is possibly the single most important piece of data in the history of medicine, and the pharmaceutical industry buries it, because if people understood that they carry their own pharmacy inside them, trillions of dollars in drug sales would evaporate. The double-slit experiment, which physics has studied for over 100 years, shows that subatomic particles behave as waves of probability until the moment a conscious observer enters the process. At the moment of observation, the wave collapses and becomes solid matter. Reality at its most fundamental level reacts to who is watching. This is backed by laboratory data, replicated thousands of times. The phenomena we call miracles may be exactly that. Moments when human consciousness, focused with extreme intensity, forces the probability field to materialize into a specific outcome. But how have two seemingly rival systems managed to keep this curtain in place for so long? To answer that, You need to stop looking up and start following the money. Religion is probably the most profitable and enduring enterprise in history. For centuries, the Church converted the fear of hell into gold, land, and political influence. In the Middle Ages, the forgiveness of sins had a fixed price list, the so-called indulgences. Today, the mechanism is more discreet, but the numbers are still enormous. The Vatican Bank moves billions a year through opaque financial circuits, exempt from taxation. Protestant megachurches in the United States rake in hundreds of millions annually. Islamic foundations manage fortunes. Tithes and donations remain the currency of existential fear. Now science, 100% of relevant research on the planet depends on a grant funding system. The ones distributing those grants are transnational corporations, military-industrial complexes, and private foundations belonging to a handful of families. When a pharmaceutical company pours millions into a university lab to test a drug, the chance that the results will go against the sponsor's interest is zero. A researcher who publishes inconvenient data loses funding, gets fired, and becomes an academic pariah. Excommunication in the Middle Ages and funding cuts in the 21st century produce the exact same effect: professional death. When the financial flows from both sides are traced to the top of the pyramid, they meet. The same elites who invest billions in maintaining materialist science are, at the same time, the biggest silent funders of the major religious institutions. This is not a war between two worldviews. It's a company with two commercial departments and a single board of directors. The rivalry between them is the most successful business play of all time. Here, the blind spot takes its most concrete form: money. Religion monopolized the right to talk about what lies beyond matter. Science monopolized the right to explain matter. Both of them shout the same thing at us: don't touch the workings of the universe, you're too small for that. While we fight over which side to pick, those who control both keep accumulating power and making sure nobody looks in the right place. And if this structure has power over money and over what's taught in schools, it has power over something even bigger: the past. Because whoever controls history controls the future. Our history was rewritten to look much shorter and much simpler than it really is. Religion insists the world is a little over 6,000 years old. Science allows us to believe that human civilization began 10 or 12,000 years ago, with primitive gatherers. Anything that falls outside these two frames is immediately discarded as heresy or a statistical anomaly. But when Axiom analyzed the findings of so-called forbidden archaeology, the official timeline fell apart. Tungsten springs were found embedded in geological layers over 100,000 years old. Gold chains trapped inside blocks of coal from the Carboniferous period, more than 300 million years old. Megaliths in South America and Egypt, cut from diorite, one of the hardest stones in existence, with joints so precise that a razor blade won't fit between the blocks. Isaac Newton, the supreme icon of rational physics, wrote throughout his life dozens of times more material on alchemy and biblical numerology than on gravity. Official science erases this fact from school textbooks because it blurs the line between the rational and the mystical that holds up the entire structure. Axiom cross-referenced religious texts from every tradition with the founding works of modern science and found a discovery that should disturb both sides. Both use the same linguistic structures to induce obedience. The amen at the end of a prayer and the phrase "scientifically proven" at the end of a news report produce the same reaction in the brain. They switch off the filter of doubt and activate automatic acceptance. The two speak different languages, but they transmit the same command: don't think for yourself, trust our authority. The question that's been hanging in the air since the beginning now demands an answer. If both of them lie, why did they do it? Why did they build two systems that pretend to hate each other but operate in perfect sync? The answer lies in the way the human brain works. We need conflict to feel alive and engaged. We need to pick a side, defend a flag, have an enemy. Whoever designed this structure understood that. If there were only one control system, monolithic, with no opposition, sooner or later humanity would find the cracks, band together, and tear the whole thing down. The probability of that outcome is 100%. That's why they gave us two systems. They split us into two eternally opposing camps. On one side, the proud skeptics who lean on formulas. On the other, the frightened faithful who lean on dogma. They made us fight for centuries over whether we came from clay or from apes, so long as we never looked toward the third possibility. While we're distracted in this staged arena, whoever stands behind both of them harvests the most valuable currency in existence, our attention. Quantum physics has shown that the conscious observer influences the behavior of matter. Where the focus of millions of minds is concentrated, that's where creative energy concentrates. Golden temples, university amphitheaters, and television screens compete for every second of our attention because it's what feeds the structure. Without our focus, it can't sustain itself. We are not what we were told we are. We are not a chemical accident on a lost rock in space, as science says, and we are not the flawed servants of a heavenly master who threatens us with eternal fire, as religion says. It has become clear that the universe was calibrated with a precision that rules out chance, that the sacred texts are edited copies from much older sources, that our DNA carries marks of intervention that don't match natural evolution, that a global catastrophe was real and was turned into a tool of fear, that our consciousness is not produced by the brain but received by it, that the human mind is capable of altering physical matter in ways science would rather ignore, and that the money funding both sides of the trench comes from the same vault. The blind spot now closes. At the beginning, the question was whether the fight between science and religion was just a smokescreen. The answer from the data is direct. There was never a real fight. They're two halves of the same pair of scissors, cutting generation after generation away from the chance to see what we really are. And what we are, according to everything that was analyzed, is far greater than either version is willing to admit. Our whole lives, we've been taught that we're small, fragile, dependent, and that we need someone above us to guide us, whether a god or a credentialed expert. Priests in golden robes offer a connection to the sacred in exchange for submission. Priests in lab coats offer protection against disease in exchange for obedience to their rules. But what all of this reveals is that we don't need middlemen. The ability to influence reality lives inside each one of us, hidden in exactly the place both sides taught us never to look. Axiom did its job. From here on out, the choice of what to do with this information belongs to each of us. This time, for the first time in millennia, it's a real choice. If you liked this investigation, subscribing to the channel helps us expand the Axiom Investigation Project. We would love to read your thoughts on the video's subject in the comments and your suggestion for the next topic to be covered. Tell us which city you are watching from. Thank you for staying with us until the end.